Okay, this is the second day of completing the square. This is the last day of it. We have a quiz on all this stuff tomorrow. What we did yesterday is learn how to create a value that makes a perfect square trinomial. Today what we're going to do is use what we learned yesterday to actually solve the quadratic equation. Now keep in mind, in terms of solving, Monday we learned how to solve using algebra. Tuesday we learned how to solve using factoring. Now we're going to be talking about solving by completing the square. Keep in mind that algebra only really requires balance. So you can make whatever decision you want as long as it is a balanced decision and you don't break the rules of balance. So what it means is that we can create a value and add it to the left side of the equation as long as we offset it by adding the same value to the right side. So this is what you're going to write in terms of how you solve by completing the square. Isolate the x terms, which we'll talk about. Add the perfect square values because that's your balance. If we add it to the left, we have to also add it to the right. And then we're just going to solve it based off of what we learned Monday, because that is why we needed to know what we knew Monday in order to wrap up the completing the square stuff. So you might need to pause this for a second because I am about to switch slides or switch papers, but you just want to make sure you have to write this portion down before moving on for your notes today. So it's going to say, blatantly going to say, solve this by completing the square. Let me just tell you again, completing the square is typically not what people choose to use unless you just like it. But in the problem where it tells you to complete the square, you have to actually complete the square, otherwise you don't get any credit. So other than that, first thing we said was to isolate the x's. Notice we have an x squared and an x, and then we have a 3 that does not belong. So what we're going to do is send the 3 over here. Remember that if it's positive over here, it becomes negative over there. So we rewrite it as x squared plus 8x equals negative 3. Alright. Now what we are going to do is we are going to make this a perfect square. So we're going to put x squared plus 8x plus we don't know what, remember we did that, equals negative 3. Well, the thing is, if I add some value that we don't know, we have to also add that same value over here. Now we go through our process. Remember, we put x plus half of 8 being 4 squared, which means that 4 squared being 16, 16 goes here. And if we just made a 16 out of nowhere, we also have to put a 16 over there. And then this turns into 13 because negative 3 plus 16 is 13. Again, all we did was we added the 16 to both sides, and then we simply simplified the side over here. We didn't need to simplify this side because we know this turned into that perfect squared trinomial or perfect squared factored form. Now we solve. Remember, we moved the weakest thing first. The parentheses is stronger than the exponent, so what we want to do now is square root both sides. Please do not forget that when you square root both sides, you get plus or minus 13. And the last thing we do is subtract 4. Now from here, I think it's safest to do it the way we'd like to do it here without having to do the full algebra stuff or the full arrangement stuff, because for me, remember, this represents two numbers. And so the two numbers you're going to get are 13 minus 4 and also negative 13 minus 4, which ends up being 9 over here and negative 17 over there. Those would be your two answers. Actually, no, it's not 13. It's square root of 13. So I just screwed that up. So it's square root of 13 minus 4 and negative square root of 13 minus 4. And so when we do that, we have to actually do square root of 13 equals, remember that you don't want to put all that together, minus 4 equals, so we got negative 0.39 and negative square root of 13 equals minus 4, which gives us negative 7.61. Always go to the hundredths place on these numbers, and that is that. Alright, so I'm sorry about that part, but again, when you're talking about that, the plus or minus square root of 13 represents two numbers, and so when you get here, you simply take the positive version with that, which is here, and the negative version with that, which is here, and you wrap all that up. Alright. Looking at the second one again, two x's and a non-x, move that over here, it's going to become a positive 5, so we end up with x squared minus 6x equals 5. Now we're going to complete the square, so we're going to add some value to this side, which means we also have to add that same value to that side. We put this in factored form, being x minus half of 6 is 3. 3 squared makes 9, which means 9 also goes up here. This is already done, but this turns into 14 when we simplify that piece over there. Remember, the first thing we're going to get rid of is outside the parentheses, so we square root both sides. We get x minus 3 equals plus or minus square root of 14. And then the last thing we do is add 13 to both sides, which gives us our answer. We just need to make sure we do it the right way. And again, remember, this represents two numbers, so we get a square root of 14 plus 13, and we get a negative square root 14 plus 13, which we can just do right here. Equals plus 13 is 16.74. Negative square root of 14 equals plus 13 equals 9.26, because that 8 bumps the 5 up. And that would be our two answers in that question. Alright. Just making sure we got the process. Let's just do two more. Make sure everything is square, that you at least understand what's going on. That should be equal 0, by the way. So again, when we have that and we move that over to the equal 0, we get x squared plus 12x equals negative 1. We then have to complete the square, so x squared plus 12x plus something equals negative 1 plus that same something. Now we put this into perfect squared form. X plus 6, because half of 12 is 6. 6 squared comes up as 36, which means that's the same number I'm going to put up there. Then remember, you go ahead and put these two things together, which makes 35. Keep in mind, now we solve as usual, which means now we do the square root of both sides, bringing down x plus 6 equals plus or minus square root of 35. And the last thing we're going to do is subtract 6, which gives us the two answers of root 35 minus 6 and negative root 35 minus 6, which we then type into our calculator appropriately. Second, x squared 35 equals minus 6 gives us the answer of negative 0.08. Negative square root of 35 equals minus 6, which is negative 11.92, because the 6 bumps the 1 up to a 2. And again, if this is on your computer, those are the two answers that you're going to type in with your comma. The reason you know you're messing up is because you forget to do the plus or minus on your sign. Last one. Again, this all equals 0, and this is a non-x that needs to be moved, and so we end up with x squared plus 2x equals negative 7, because remember, use the opposite when you move it. Again, we have to complete the square, so x squared plus 2x plus something equals negative 7 plus something. When we go to do our perfect square, we get x plus half of that is 1. 1 squared is 1. Bring this over as 1, and you get the answer of negative 6 over here. Square root both sides. You get x plus 1 equals plus or minus square root of negative 6, which when you subtract 1, you get x equals, you get square root of negative 6 minus 1, and you get the negative square root of negative 6 minus 1. And there is an issue here that we have not talked about yet, because when you do the square root of negative 6, it actually gives you a non-real answer. What that means is, remember, square root of 9 means I want a number that multiplies by itself to be 9. That is 3 times 3. It is also negative 3 times negative 3. There is nothing that multiplies by itself to be a negative 9. And I know you're thinking that negative 3 is your answer, but that's not it, because negative 3 times itself is a positive 9, which means that because this is a square root of negative 6, we actually could have stopped right here. If you catch that, this means that there is no solution. Once you get a negative under the radical, it means that it's not possible to solve this problem. Okay? So if you see that on today's work, if you see that on the quiz tomorrow, and you get a negative under it, the first thing you want to do is make sure you did everything right, which we did. And then outside of that, because you can't do a square root of a negative, just say it's no solution. And here is your hint that there's no solution, because it says it's a non-real answer. In other words, it's something that's out of our scope of what we understand. So again, other than that, go ahead and go to your Math Excel, begin working on that, knocking that out, and let's see what happens. And again, I'm here today, so be sure to ask me questions about whatever it is you have issues with. Good luck.